Hey, everybody, welcome to another special episode of the Fantasy Fiends podcast in tandem with Indie Fantasy Addicts. Man, I always get on Stevie for screwing up the intro, and now I pretty much went and screwed it up. So, Stevie, if you're watching this, I apologize for always getting on your case, but I will get on your case again on Thursday for screwing up. We've got a really fun episode today talking about Fae, which is like fairies, sort of the origin of elves. Lots of really interesting stuff that I actually don't know much about that. So we're going to get right to the experts talking about it. Why don't you ladies go ahead and introduce yourself, starting with Stacey.
Sorry, I was a little delayed there. Hi, I am Stacey. I'm somewhat new of an indie author. I've been on the Indie Fantasy Addicts for a while as a reader, and I have 4 books out. My most recent is, if I can lean the right way, Trial of Thorns, which is a Fae book, of course, that's why I'm here. And it is kind of like a Hunger Games kind of.
Very cool.
Thing.
Very cool. Michelle.
All right. Hi, I'm Michelle. I've been an indie author for about 7 years, and my first Fae book releases April 22nd called Fae's Deception. So I'm really excited about that with my writing partner, Melissa Craven. I am the author of Golden Curse. That's probably my best known book. And I'm really excited to be here with you guys.
Very cool. Danielle.
Hi, I am both traditionally and indie published, and I have my debut series actually is 4 books that focus around trolls, which are actually part of the Fae mythology and are ultimately fairies. So I have 4 books of experience with them, and then I have another YA fantasy series that has no Fae, and an adult fantasy series that also has no Fae. So I'll have to be reaching back into my history for all my Fae lore.
Very cool. I'm excited. Audrey.
Hey guys, my name is Audrey Grey, and I'm a YA fantasy author. My Fae book that most of you probably know me by is Evermore Academy, Winter. And I also have an epic fantasy series that's YA, The Kingdom of Runes. And the characters aren't Fae, but they're very Fae-like, the mythology and lore. So those are probably the 2 big series that you guys know me from.
Awesome. And last but definitely not least, Sarah.
I'm Sarah K.L. Wilson. I'm best known for my Dragon Skull series, but my most recent series that's coming out is Tangled Fae, and that's where my Fae books come into things for today.
Very cool. Well, you know what? Let's get down to what the heck a Fae is. I obviously definitely know, but for people who don't know, tell me a little bit about the Fae, what it means to be Fae.
I unmuted myself like I had something really profound to say. I think that they're one of the reasons why writers are drawn to the Fae is because there's such a broad mythology coming from a whole bunch of different places with Fae-like creatures. And so, you have this huge amount of material that you can draw from, whereas there's maybe less of a spectrum if you're going into other paranormal creatures. So I don't think you can pin it down as just one thing. But I always think of Shakespeare as sort of the literary beginning, or one of the literary beginnings for me as far as my access point to Fae. I don't know about the rest of you.
Is that Oberon and Lady Titania?
Yes, as I mute myself.
What's the play?
That would be Midsummer's Night Dream. Yeah.
I remembered it. Haha. I know literary things.
How fortunate, given that you are a literary person.
I know. So, but Fae, the origin of Fae traces back to sort of Irish, Celtic, Gaelish mythology, right?
Yeah, like the leaving out the milk for the fairies so they don't steal your children. And some tie-ins, they think possibly to Druidic backgrounds. Maybe even some people speculate Stonehenge. And of course, there's Eastern mythology surrounding it too. Well, not Eastern, but Eastern European, having to do with the Fae. Actually, Miranda Honfleur's book with Nicolette Andrews, Witch of the Lake, that draws out the Eastern European Fae ideas.
Interesting. Anyone else want to add something?
I mean, I think that one of the things that's really interesting about it is it's so important to a lot of cultures. So you have a lot of, it was something that was believed by, and maybe still is believed by people in certain cultures. And people actually took a lot of actions in their daily lives in order to not anger the Fae or, various things. So, you're not only drawing upon fictional type stuff in the sense of Shakespeare, you're drawing upon, not exactly like historical record, but people in history interacting them at least on, I don't know, what's the word? Help me out here, guys. Like on a mythological, as part of their culture. Help me out.
Superstitiously.
There we go. There's the word. Level. So you get a lot of resources coming from a lot of different places rather than just fiction.
There are definitely still people who believe in the Fae thing, like in real life. If you just Google, or if you just go on YouTube, I think on YouTube, and you'll find people who are like instruct you on how to summon Fae. Like this is a thing. So yeah, it's really widespread and it goes back really far and is now too. So.
And I think
even in sorry.
Why you get so many details, world building type details, is because it's almost as though they are actually part of our world. So there's so much to draw upon there.
And even in our indie fantasy addicts group, when we brought up Fae, D.W. Hawkins chimed in with a current conspiracy theory about the Tartarian Empire, which sent me on a terrible rabbit trail of figuring out what the heck these people believe. It took me like an hour to figure it out, but there's still like people today who believe that supernatural beings, basically like Fae, have been around interfering with history for millennia. It's pretty interesting.
Sort of like the lizard people, but not lizards, Fae instead.
I think that's where you get a lot of the connections. One of my favorite thing about Fae is that most Fae stories connect to the human world. And I think a lot of these beliefs of humans actually believing they exist have made their way into literature with, humans being dragged into the Fae world, or just customs like changelings. Some humans used to believe that if a baby was sick, it meant that it was a changeling, which led to some really gruesome and horrible things. A changeling, obviously, you guys all know what a changeling is, but a Fae leaving their child for the humans, and it's that connection to the human world, the interest you see in a lot of literature that Fae are interested in humans, just like humans in the real world are interested in Fae. And I think that's probably one of the best things about them, is that it's not just this separate fantasy world.
I think that a lot of people would have seen reference to that in the Outlander show, where Claire tries to rescue a baby that's been left under the belief that it's a changeling, which is the reason why it's sickly. And, it's just, you can see even in a show like that, which is only loosely fantasy in the time travel sort of aspect of it, but seeing the Fae being part of Scottish culture in that way, it touches upon so much of our history. So
it's interesting. As I love to do, I just did a little bit of research on the fly, and it says so the most common description of sort of the fairies is the Seelie and the Unseelie court. That light versus dark elves, or that's where it was originated from, the Germanic concept of sort of light and dark elves. But then it's also in Irish fairy and folk tales by William Butler Yeats, it was divided into trooping fairies, which is usually like the perception of the lighter fairies, where everything is like a parade or a court or a dance, like everything is a spectacle. And then there's the solitary fairies, which are originally mischievous spirits appearing on their own, but then it could also be sort of like more the outcasts. and stuff. But then there's also the domesticated fairies. I don't know if you've seen the tailor or the cobbler and the elves or something, where they come into his house and they make all the shoes for him or something like that's another really popular one from both Germanic and I guess Hans Christian Andersen, that style of storytelling. And I wonder where it all came from. Do you guys have any thoughts on like how the myth of fairies originated, like way, way, way back when?
I think that a lot of people are looking for explanations for the things that can't be explained. So that was probably a lot of the root cause, but I don't actually know the original origin history. Does anyone else?
I don't know either, but I think it's easy to pick a scapegoat for things that don't go well around your village or that aren't going well in your home. And especially if you're the one who maybe was at fault, it's easier to blame it on the fairies.
or like something goes missing. I think that was a really, really popular one, is when something went missing, it was the fairies' fault. Like that was, I think that's one of like the earliest versions of it. Someone mentioned brownies. What is a brownie?
I've never written about them. Somebody else jump in.
Well, we posted the other day, I posted someone's doctorate paper that they had written about fairies, and it was linking it all back to the Middle Ages and when all this stuff started. And there was a whole list of different names that people had for like lesser fairies, like brownies and boggins, and I can't remember all of them. But if you read Holly Black's books, her most recent Folk of the Air series, she like has all these different ones named off. And they all have different like roles as serving fairies that like shine the fancy fairies' shoes and make them clothes and serve their meals and all that kind of thing. And this document I had found and posted in the IFA group, Indie Fantasy Addicts group, it kind of outlined a list of those, which was kind of handy for me, but I didn't go all the way back into it.
Interesting. So I guess the next question is, what are your fairies? Like, tell me about the Fae characters or the Fae races in your stories. Go ahead, whoever wants to take this one.
Yes, I can go, since it's not really out yet. We went more of the elven way, which, fairies influenced elves a lot. And so we call them Fae. We don't call them elves, but they've got the pointy ears. They have, we went with the different courts, kind of like Sarah J. Maas's series, where she has, the various courts that the courts kind of don't change a lot. So we have the court that's, we call it different things, but that's, always snowy and icy, and the court that's really hot and things like that. And our Fae, we decided not to go the way of not being able to lie, because our Fae are tricky and they lie a lot, and you never know exactly what's going on. And it's, they were a lot of fun to write because of that.
Mine are pretty similar too. I went to I didn't do the Unseelie and Seelie courts, but I made up my own, and I kind of made them elemental. So I have, like they each have their own power. One can control ice, one water, one electricity, one fire. I have 12 of them, I think. And I named them based on that. So I've got the Shadow Court, and I've got the Luminescent Court, which is the light, got the Flicker Court, and that sort of thing. And it's based almost entirely in the Fae realm, so I don't get into like the human aspect of it too much. I will at some point as it goes on. But yeah, so they're just beautiful, powerfully magical creatures who are also dangerous, and that was kind of like the aspect that I played on the most in mine.
Interesting. One thing that I saw in one author's portrayal is that the fairies, they're kind, like compared to they're like the good ones, or the Seelie versus the Unseelie. They're kind, but not necessarily good. They can, they're not evil compared to their other ones, but they can be just as manipulative, just as, self-serving in a way. And that's always a fun sort of balance to play with, is these, the stereotypes of the good versus bad fairies, light versus dark, but then flipping it around and getting creative with the interpretation of it. Sarah, you had mentioned we had you on a podcast a few weeks back, or months back probably, and you were talking about it. Tell us a little bit more about the fairies in your book.
So mine are not Steely or Unsteely. They're just all bad. And they're this
Good.
tangled, twisted, evil bunch who basically deserve each other. But they, at various times, they can slip into the human world through stone circles, kind of like a mini Stonehenge. And when they come in there, it's basically if they can trick a person to come into their world, then they can go into the humans' world. And so they're tricking people at the beginning of the story to come into their world so they can run into the human world and cause as much trouble as possible. And my Fae, they because of the way that they're created, they can't tell lies, but they are always lying to you with the truth. And they're always tricking people, trying to get as much as they possibly can out of the mortal world and suck it as dry as possible. So they will steal your children if they can. And they won't replace them with fairy children, but they will steal them and turn them into their children because they can't have them themselves. And our main character is desperately trying to defend the human world from this invasion of the Fae, who eventually find a way to get in without tricking people to go a 1-for-1 swap. And they have golems serving them as their servants because, of course, they would never get their hands dirty with actual work. And they have one of their courts are basically orcs. They're green in color and they love violence and to destroy as much as possible. So I've really had a lot of fun with this very evil bunch of people who mostly are like they're evil, but they're also trickstery evil and mischievous evil. And they like to just mess with you for the sake of messing with you kind of evil. So like if you got like the worst of prankster reality TV shows and made those people run the world, that's basically what you'd get with my Fae.
That sounds like a recipe for a lot of fun.
I've had a lot of fun writing it.
Good. All right. And Audrey.
Yeah, so I just wanted to, before I talk about mine, I read Sarah's, the first book in her Fae series, and it's amazing. Like, I feel like she does Fae really well because she does like the trickster, kind of mischievous, whimsical side, but then she contrasts it with just like they can be really evil. And they don't really see what's wrong with that. And so, yeah, I love her. Her book was awesome in portraying Fae. And then just to kind of share about the world of Evermore Academy, it was my first time actually venturing into Fae, and I had a lot of fun. I kind of mixed it up. Like I didn't do, they can lie. So I kind of put a more modern twist on a lot of things, but it's kind of a dystopian as well. And the Fae world has kind of merged with ours through a war. And so you see a lot of like, in the modern world, humans kind of bargaining with the Fae, and that kind of like, so people high up, like humans high up in the world, have at some point bargained with the Fae, and their children are sent to this academy as kind of, that was their bargain. And the kids are there actually kind of as servants, the humans, but they're also there to protect the Fae. And because there's really bad Fae that have been infected kind of with this magic that will try to kill the regular Fae, and humans are the only ones that can hold like iron weapons. And so they're trained to actually protect, their Fae. And as far as like the magic in the courts, I did do courts. They're broken up by Seelie and Unseelie. So the Seelie is like, of course, summer and spring. And I think there's like a, dawn court, a star court, and then my favorite, which is the mythological creatures court. So I kind of had fun throwing in actually like vampires and all the other supernatural kind of beings that you love to see in paranormal, like supernatural story. So I kind of worked that way, worked those into my Fae. And then the Unseelie, of course, are like the, autumn and winter and star or Dust Court, things like that. So I just kind of had a lot of fun with it. And I also have a like soul magic in it as well, which was really fun. It's called Soulmancy, and that's how they in my story is actually immortal. So it's kind of like reincarnation, and they're just constantly reincarnating. But only the Evermore type of Fae in my books can do that, which is why they're called Evermore. So I had a lot of fun with it.
Now let me ask you all this: like, where, if you had to sort of pinpoint one or two sources that would say you could say inspired you or shaped your creation of the fairies, what would they be?
I was a big Laurel K. Hamilton fan back in the day when I was younger. And I really liked her series that includes the Fae. And I think that that was my first place where I started seeing them used in this sort of sexy creatures that were part of our world, but not part of our world. And that was sort of my starting point for interest, although it was like a decade later until I actually wrote my own fairy type novel. But I'd say for me, it was almost all fictional inspiration, things that other authors had written that I just really liked how fun they were and all the different elements and all that sort of stuff. So that was what it was for me.
Sorry, go ahead.
Also, all fiction stuff. I would say probably my number one is probably The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, which was already mentioned. And those Fae are it's very dark. It's almost like bully romance almost. And I don't know if you'd call it a romance, but yeah, or Court of Thorns and Roses, definitely a little bit because that one's so popular. Even going back all the way back to the Hollow Kingdom. I don't know if anybody knows that book, but that was one of my absolute favorites. And that one's pretty dark. It's more goblins than anything. And I'm obsessed with goblins. So yeah, lots of fiction stuff that goes into that stuff.
I actually just finished Holly Black series a couple days ago, and now I have biggest book hangover ever. That series is amazing. But for me, I started wanting, before I decided I wanted to write Fae, I wanted to write a specific thing about Fae, and that was I wanted to write about a changeling. And that was because Danielle, you mentioned Outlander, and actually that's where that kind of sparked the idea. I'm a huge Outlander fan, the books, the show. And so that kind of got me thinking, like when I read that book that it was in, that was like the first book forever ago. And it kind of always stuck in my mind. And then I read A Court of Thorns and Roses and started realizing that, and started researching Fae and the different kinds of Fae. And I've always been anything with elves. I've always loved elves. So just kind of, I guess what you guys have said, fictional inspirations that led to research that inspired more.
I read Terry Pratchett's book, Lords and Ladies, in my teens. It was amazing. And the Fae are the super bad guys in that one, and the witches are fighting against them up on the mountaintop. And I really liked how he depicted the Fae. They were just evil and tricky and squirmy, and they didn't look as beautiful as they pretended to look because they had this glamour they put on everybody. But underneath, they were these terrible, ragged creatures. And I just loved that so much. I desperately wanted to write it. And then I started reading more Fae books. Actually, I read Danielle's Malediction books. And she didn't get a chance to tell you about her Fae, but hers were called Trolls at the beginning. And I loved that. I loved how they were kind of malformed and misshapen, and yet they were magical and beautiful at the same time. And I found that really inspiring. I read like a ton of other ones then too, but those were the ones that were like really formational when I was starting to write my book. I also want to throw a little shout out because I read Audrey's book too and adored it, her Evermore book. But yeah, it was Pratchett mostly who started me out.
Very cool. Audrey, did you give us your origin story?
I didn't, but all of the ones mentioned, I haven't read Terry Pratchett, but a lot of the other books, Holly Black, of course, she's kind of the Fae queen. I mean, I think everyone agrees she's the Fae queen, at least with the modern books. One that hasn't been mentioned that I loved, that I think is probably one of the best portrayals of Fae, is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. And I loved that book. I mean, some people I think complained because it was a little bit slow, but it was so meticulously detailed. And her fae in that book are kind of like, they have the glamour. So some of the other books, and they're not quite as beautiful as they look, and they need humans to do things for them, like make clothing or paintings and that kind of stuff. And they kind of have this really evil kind of using relationship with humans. But it was masterful world building and a great portrayal of the Fae. So for me, as far as Fae goes, I think she nailed it, and I love that. So
interesting. Now, one thing that I noticed as we were talking about all of this is, with the exception of Terry Pratchett, every other author mentioned is female. Every other author of Fae books that have been successful or that people fell in love with are female. Why do you think that is? Why have you read have any guys tried to tackle Fae, or is it just not the kind of thing they tackle, or what is it about female writers that excel when it comes to dealing with the Fae? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think right now a lot of the trad books that are popular are young adult, and I mean, A Court of Thorns and Roses is called young adult, not really young adult, but it's like romance. And a lot of people these days, they're reading, not always, but Fae romance young adult books. And that's a genre that is heavily, heavily female. The readers, the writers. And so that's definitely going to influence that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, that women dominate the YA market, and fairies and fae-related things have really had a lot of popularity for 7, 8, 9, 10 years in YA. So
I don't disagree with that at all. It's probably absolutely true, but I was also, as you asked, I had another thought that I figured I'd bring in. So one of the things that I love most about Fae is that they are incredibly powerful, incredibly dangerous, and I love the trickster aspects too. But they use their beauty and as their to hide their danger, and I feel like that's kind of like a womanly trait to seduce and to. I mean, not that I'm a very seducing person, but in general, women, they use their beauty to kind of hide when they're dangerous and hide their power. And sometimes use it as their power. So I don't know. That was just what came to mind. That's kind of like.
That's legit.
Interesting. One thing that this may sound silly, but thinking about like if you think about all of the things, or a lot of what makes the Fae and fairies so marvelous is the color, the sparkling, the glitter, the beauty, the subtle shades. Like there's a lot of things about that they say that female writers tend to do better than male writers. And I feel like when it comes to the Fae specifically, a lot of those things really play into those distinctions to a much greater degree than if you have like the more traditional types of fantasy where it's sword fighting. Everybody can write that pretty well, because that's the kind of thing that everyone will have sort of a same perspective on it. But when it comes to things like the Fae, women naturally have a better perception of color than men. That is just that's science right there. And so being able to tell and think about and visualize those things, I think a lot of that comes into action and comes into play when writing these more marvelous and magical and mystical moments in the fairy kingdom. No one wants to argue. No one wants to debate that with
me. Like a male author's input here, because I think we're, except for you, Andy, women. So it's hard for us to say.
I can tell you right now that I wrote one fancy ballroom setting.
How was that for you?
It was great because I got to write the stuff that I could think about, that I could see, but it wasn't, so I listened to the Sarah J. Maas Throne of Glass, right? And when Selena comes out in her dress, right, the dress is explained down to just these details that are just wow. Like I could envision it down to the ruffles, which I don't know anything about ruffles, but like, and when I wrote my ballroom scene, it was like, all right, so people were dressed in fancy gowns and shit, and there was lots of wine. Oh, let's get into the wine, or let's get into the music, or whatever my perspective was. It's different, and so I think that's, in a way, that's kind of what makes those things so successful when written by women, is because those are the things that play up more. When you have those super ornate dresses made of leaves, all of those different colored leaves, like that's a detail that I can picture. But when you get into the super ornate descriptions, that's just beyond my capabilities.
I always think of Robert Jordan though when I think of clothes, because he is so detailed.
He talks about clothes so much, and about smoothing those dresses over those hips like 1,000 times.
The embroidery on coats.
That's funny. I remembered skipping over those parts. I'm like, yeah, they're wearing coats, and where's the sword fighting?
I mean, I'm a woman and I can't write that stuff. Like in my Fae books, I am lucky that I have a writing partner who's really, really good at that stuff. But I'll write in my book like, okay, they're coming up to the castle, description needed here, and she'll go back and like describe the entire castle, because I just can't do it. And in my solo fantasy books, any of my readers will tell you that I tend to err on the side of less description, just because I'm not any good at it. Everything will sound exactly the same, so I just kind of let the action move the story forward instead of the descriptions.
Interesting.
Well, maybe we can find some brave male soul who will write us a face series, and we can have him on next time.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Someone mentioned Eric Asher. I have never heard of his Fae stuff, but evidently it's fabulous. So that's cool. Now let me ask you this. What is the one thing or one or two things that has to be included into the story to make it actually Fae? Like without it, it wouldn't work. As it wouldn't qualify as Fae, let's say.
I think that there's some things that are really common, but I think we've heard from pretty much everybody saying that there's things that they did not include. Not being able to lie is something that I included, but you don't need to. Sensitivities to certain materials like iron, sometimes to salt, are important, but you still don't need to include them. And I think because it's such a rich mythology, I'm not sure there actually is any two things that you must include. I don't know. Someone argue with me.
I think the only thing I would say is magic, but that's super basic. So, I mean, like if you have fantasy, you don't necessarily need magic, but yeah, they're magical creatures. I don't know how you would do it without some sort of like whimsical magic, but otherwise I agree. I don't know. There's not a whole lot.
I think some sort of Fae feature, like it doesn't always have to be the same, but they can't just be, the same as humans, I guess. Like whether you put horns on them, like Holly Black puts horns and tails and all of that kind of stuff on them. Whether you give them pointed ears or translucent skin or just kind of some kind of feature that differentiates them from human.
Interesting.
So for me, like one of the things that I mean doesn't necessarily have to be there, but seems to always be there, and I love is kind of the political infighting, like between the courts. And you don't even have to have the courts, but I think that is one of the things that I love about the Fae is they have different factions or courts or however they do it. They're constantly trying to like trick each other, betray each other, get ahead, and that's one of my favorite things to read about.
I think that they're manipulative is a pretty common one. That they that they are tricksters, and that I think feeds into what Audrey said about them having all this political intrigue, because it works so well with that type of dynamic when you have these supernatural creatures that rely a lot on intelligence and trickery and deception in order to get away. or to get ahead. And so that works really well with politics.
It's a good point.
I think I might also say that, correct me if you think this is wrong, but they think themselves better than humans, or they want to be better than humans in some way. So like because they're obviously separate beings, and that's kind of part of what motivates them is their relationship with humans. I would say that's pretty universal.
But also usually a fascination with humans.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in Margaret Robertson's book, where they and Holly's as well, where you see them coming to the human world for this sort of fresh, mortal take on artwork and life and whatnot, and that is the reason why you are constantly seeing this dynamic between humans and fae. It's not like with vampires where they feed upon them. It's more of a fascination and inspiration and a need in a different way.
I think jealousy too, a little bit.
Yeah.
And to tie into that, they almost always seem to be very long-lived. I've never read any book with fae where they weren't incredibly long-lived. And so to them, mortals are like gadflies, like their lives are fleeting, and that's part of their fascination with them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in my series, in Stolen Songbird, I took a spin upon the fae sensitivity to iron, because I always wondered how the fae could be in our world and consume our food and just live when everything has iron in it. So, what if the buildup and the slow poisoning them affected them some way? So my fae have become mortal and become trapped in the human realm because of their consumption and fascination with humanity, basically weighed them down with iron. But they're still seek immortality because it's something that was lost to them.
Very interesting. Well, you know what? Why don't we get into a little bit more about the Fae characters that you're writing about? Pick a character that you particularly like or connect with, and tell us a little bit about them, what makes them unique, and what makes them super relatable for people who are reading them. Anyone can answer.
Well, for me, my main Fae guy who shows up through the books is named Scalvril, which is not his real name, but Fae often won't give you their real name. And his whole thing is he has a role in the Fae world, and there's 4 people who have a special role, and his is as the knave. And his whole purpose in life is to mess things up for everyone else, including other Fae. And he has almost like a compulsion inside him that forces him to mess up anything that's working well, because that is his role in life and in the world. And I find him really fun. He gets trapped in the first book in a little bird cage and made small to the size of like your palm by our main character, and she carries him around in the cage, and his snide little remarks through the whole book kind of make the book worth reading.
I remember that we read a snippet of that on the podcast episode where we had you. That was fun.
We did. And then the next book, he has her in the cage, and we get to see things from his perspective as the knave wrecking everything, and she gets to watch. And I just find him an interesting character because whatever you'd expect him to do, he's probably going to do the opposite of that. Whether that's good, like whether you think that's beneficial or unbeneficial, if you expect something bad from him, he might even do something that's good for you, even though he's not a very good person.
Interesting. Do you play with sort of those the expectations thrust upon you by these kind of roles, the sort of burden of being the knave? Like I always kind of think about how Loki, the trickster god, would feel stifled by that stereotype and want to break free of it, but then whether it was a magical compulsion he couldn't, or do you play with that a bit?
Yeah, there are things he desperately wants in the Fae world that he can't get for himself, and he's trying to manipulate other people into a position where they'll make those things happen because his compulsion makes it impossible for him to do them.
Interesting. Very cool. Who else wants to share a little bit about their Fae character?
I guess I'll go. So in Evermore Academy, one of my favorite Fae characters is called the Winter Prince. And he's just like you would expect. He's very moody and, has all these kind of burdens on his shoulder to be a certain way, because in the Fae world, they expect cruelty and ruthlessness. Those are kind of valued behaviors. And so he's dealing with all that. And then he also doesn't have a name until the very end, because if someone discovers his name, they can use it, magically to like bind some of his powers. And he has a lot of enemies because, that's just how the Fae are. And so probably my most favorite part about writing him is that his mood was tied to the weather. The season there is, at the academy is winter. And so anytime he's upset, it's snowy and drizzling and gray and dark and really cold. And needless to say, it was like that a lot during the book because he went through a lot of angst. So, but yeah, that was my favorite part to write, was him constantly like making the weather horrible for the main character.
And like, what makes him relatable to readers? Like, what do readers connect with about him?
I would say probably just having all these expectations to be one way, and he's in a very public forum. And so just having those expectations that he needs to be a certain way when actually he's not that way. And so I would say that's probably the biggest relatable thing about him.
Very cool.
I'll go next. I accidentally unmuted before, but my favorite character from my Fae book is the main character. I do a dual point of view, so I have the main female character and the main male character, but the female character's name is K.L, and she kind of hates herself. She's pretty complex because she was tricked into a bargain with a pretty ancient and powerful being who made her murder someone as a kid, and she can't tell anybody about it. And that has affected her like through her life. And so the story is realistically about her kind of finding redemption, even though she doesn't want redemption, but she is still seeking it in a way. She's kind of an interesting character that she wants it, but she doesn't want it because she still doesn't forgive herself. So she's my favorite character of that story.
That sounds like a really complex journey to go on.
So I actually have a secondary character in my Fae series. His name is Mark, and he is the best friend and cousin of the main male protagonist, Tristan. Mark has, as a result of the iron poisoning, effectively, the majority of the trolls that are stuck in this city are suffering in some way, whether it be mental or physical, and there's like a lot of deformity and whatnot. And everyone loves him, which is why I actually wrote a prequel novel about him. But he's extremely disfigured, and it was really interesting with me to, with the whole series, to kind of make this play upon that we innately trust beauty. And the villain, the bad guy, is so frequently cast as somebody who is monstrous in some fashion. So to have this extremely good character be the one who is one of the most visibly different, it was interesting to, especially with the Fae beauty, the Fae glamour. There's nothing that he can do to change the way that everybody perceives that he looks, because they've lost that ability. But just working with that dynamic that, beauty is not always good, and the reverse is also not true. So
that's cool. Yeah. It's not something you see come up often, but it is something that you kind of take for granted. Portrayals in movie, TV shows, even books. I like it. Michelle, what about you?
Well, I have three main characters in my book. And two of them are brothers. They are the descendants of one of the three royal lines. And when their parents were killed, their uncle took the throne and shipped the two brothers, separated them and shipped them to the other kingdoms when they were children. And so one of them, his name is Griffin, and they're the only members of this family can travel into the human realm. They have some magic in their blood that allows it. And he's not bad, but he's not good. He has a really good heart. He wants to save the main girl, the main character, but he has loyalties that kind of prevent him from doing that. And he's loyal to a fault. He's loyal to the wrong person, but he will not break his loyalties ever. And so it was a lot of fun writing kind of this conflicted character who he falls in love with the main character, but does that love, override this loyalty? And it's fun because we're writing a spin-off series that's from his point of view, not the same story, but a completely new story. And so we're really excited to kind of delve more into, he does a lot of really bad things, but he's not bad. So he, everything he does really hits him, and, he breaks his own heart time and again, which is kind of a lot of fun to write. I guess that probably makes me sound really bad, but
That's cool. All right. So now if there was one or two books that you had to recommend, if people were like, I'm totally new to Fae, I want to read something that's super, super awesome, what books would you recommend? Aside from your own, we'll get to that later. Aside from your own books, which books would you say, oh, absolutely go read that one?
Nobody's allowed to say Cruel Prince or A Court of Thorn and Roses because we've already discussed that. Now pick your brains.
Dig deep.
Well,
honestly, I would say Fae Hunter, because I think that's a really cool twist on the way Fae. I don't know if that's cheating to pick somebody in the group, but Sarah's book.
I was gonna do the same thing, because I was gonna say that I got to help pick the authors here today, and so I picked all the ones whose books I liked.
Smart.
I'd say Laurel K. Hamilton's, just because she's so kind of the beginning or early use of Fae in that paranormal urban fantasy type of space. So it's almost like reading a classic. That would be my recommendation. It's hot.
Nice. What's the name of the books or series?
I forget the exact name of the series. I'd have to look it up.
I think I tried to get those last month when they were recommended to me, and they're out of print. Like, you can't get a Kindle version.
Really?
Wow.
Because I thought you could get the Kindle ones still.
Can you? I couldn't get them, I don't think. But hopefully maybe that's changed.
She's mostly famous for her Anita Blake vampire
Hunter.
Zombie.
Yeah.
It's basically, she has all the characters. I think she even has Fae in, possibly. I don't know. I haven't read them in a long time.
Wow.
Yeah, they were great. If you can find them in a library or somewhere used on Amazon, they're great. And I think that you'll see a lot of ties to, especially Sarah J. Maas's use of Fae, I think.
I might try Abe Books for that. If anyone doesn't know, that's a place where you can find out-of-print books. It's abebooks.com.
Very cool. Someone recommended the Mary Gentry series, which I've heard of but never read.
Yeah.
None of you are familiar with that one? I think it's
That's it. Hold on. I'm going to pull it all up on my phone.
It's like a fairy. It lives in the human world and is a detective of some sort.
That's the name of her Laurel K's series, right?
Oh, okay. That's Laurel K's. Okay. Good to know.
I have a bad memory. Hold on. I can barely remember the titles of my own books. Keep talking. I'll find it.
All right. Michelle, what about you? What would be your recommendation?
It's going to sound really bad, but I actually haven't read a ton of Fae. I've read some. I read Sarah's book, and I absolutely love it. Now, hearing all you guys talk about your books makes me want to go put them on my Kindle immediately. Read G.K. DeRosa has a new Fae series out that's really good. I read, Sarah mentioned Nicolette Andrews and Miranda Honfler's series, which is amazing. Love that. I love that one because it's different. Like, you can't even completely tell it's Fae. And I love that about it. And other than that, I've read Court of Thorns and Roses. I almost gave up on The Cruel Prince, almost did, and then people are like, keep going, and then suddenly it's just like everything explodes, and it's the best series you've ever read.
Okay, I found it. Yeah, it is on Amazon, definitely as Kindle. The first one's called A Kiss of Shadows. And yeah, it is the Mary Gentry series. So I read it back when it first came out, which was like a really long time ago because I'm old and have a long history of reading. But yeah, they're really, really good. So.
And Stacey, what about you? What would be your number one recommendation?
Someone said a book that's like not really Fae, but kind of Fae. So I'm going to do one of those. I don't know if anybody has read Annette Marie. Chase the Dark is the first one. And she calls them demons, but realistically they're Fae. They have two different worlds. One's light, one's dark. They have glamours in which they're beautiful, and they're dangerous and powerful. And I absolutely love that series. So that one's one of my favorites. I also did love Evermore Academy. So we're going to plug that one too.
That's awesome. All right. Well, and now we're coming to the end of the podcast. Why don't you tell the readers and listeners and viewers and everybody else where to find you and your books, again, starting with Stacey.
Okay. I'm on Amazon. All my indie books, all my fantasy books are Kindle Unlimited, so you can get them all there, which means they're only on Amazon. My website is staceytrombley.com. Not too difficult. Yeah.
Very cool. Michelle.
Amazon. All my Lynn books are Kindle Unlimited. My website is micheillenauthor.com. And careful, there's another Michelle Lynn who doesn't write fantasy or YA. I write YA clean. So I always have to put that out there. And yeah.
Very cool. Danielle.
You could get my most of my books at any retailer, electronic or otherwise. And you can find me at DanielleLJensen.com. If you actually want to keep up with me, I'm on Instagram, Danielle L. Jensen, and that's where the best place to keep up with me because I'm a lazy newsletter writer.
And she posts some really, really awesome photos there. Totally jealous. Audrey.
So all of my books are Kindle Unlimited. So you'll find ebooks on Amazon, and I also have audiobooks out. And then my website is audreygray.com. I do respond a little better to either Facebook or Instagram. So those are good ways to reach me as well.
Both as Audrey Grey, I assume.
As Audrey Grey, correct.
Very cool. And Sarah.
You can find me on Facebook or Instagram, Sarah K.L. Wilson, or my website, sarahklwilson.com.
Very cool. Well, thank you all so much for educating us about the world of the Fae. That was really fun.
I had a blast.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. And for those of you who enjoyed hearing these ladies talk about their Fae books, check them out. You know where to find them now. And we will be back on Thursday night with our usual episode of the Fantasy Fiends podcast. Have a great day. Bye. Just keep waving at the camera. Keep